Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Holy Apostles. Thank you for coming to Your Life, Your Legacy. We haven't presented this since COVID started, and so it's very informative and it helps people prepare for end of life. So we have a few people that are going to be talking. Deacon Doug Flynn will kind of give you some of the legal aspects of it. Jamie Crane from the diocese will talk to you about legacy giving and giving. And then we have Paul Woods from Springs Funeral Home that will answer some of your questions. And at the end, I'll kind of just give you a pamphlet, if you didn't get it, about preparing for a funeral mass or, for a funeral mass, how we do it at Holy Apostles. So again, thanks for coming. The bathrooms are outside to the right, and coffee, donuts. I'm making more coffee, so enjoy.
Don't we have an age limit here?
Oh, Gary. Just say, oh, Gary.
Sherry is not old enough to be here.
And this is Deacon Doug Flynn from the diocese. Thank you for being here.
Count on Gary to just get things started right, so good to see you, and it's good to see everybody here. It has been a long time, it feels like, since we've been together, and so I was joking with Jamie before. It's like we've given this presentation to 3 people, we've given it to 30 people, we've given it to hundreds of people, but this is a good crowd, and we're glad to have you. So, as Rosemary said, I'm Deacon Doug Flynn. I'm the Chancellor and General Counsel. I used to be the General Counsel and Chief of Staff until Bishop Golka got here. And he said, well, I want you to be the chancellor. And I said, well, not to be too dense, but what does a chancellor do? He said, I have no idea. I've looked at 4 or 5 dioceses. They're all over the map. You pretty much write your own job description. So I'm learning as I go, but this is a presentation I've given many times. I know it was billed in some of the literature as Catholic teaching on end-of-life issues. We'll get there. I'll have plenty of time for questions on that. But I like to start out, I tell people I was a lawyer a lot longer than I've been a deacon, so I'll start with the stuff in my wheelhouse and talk a little bit about advanced medical directives. So this is an overview of the first, I guess, half of my presentation, and we'll talk specifically about end-of-life planning and legal issues in the state of Colorado. Every state's a little bit different here and there, and we can talk about that, and I can answer questions because some of you may have relatives either older or younger who are in other states, and so we can talk a little bit about that. So the first principle I want to make sure everybody understands when we talk about advanced directives is as long as you can make medical treatment decisions for yourselves, you should be making medical treatment decisions for yourself. So all these things we're going to talk about, living wills, powers of attorney, proxy decision making, all of those things are, in the legal community, what I say, if you can't make the decision for yourself, who does? Okay? And I'm going to be a strong proponent here today that the legal document that's probably the most flexible and most useful for you is called a medical durable power of attorney. So, yeah, we've got graduations going on upstairs, so bear with us. So we'll talk about medical powers of attorney, living will, CPR directives, and proxy decision makers, and then the most recent in Colorado is a medical order for the scope of treatment. They're in the order I'm going to talk about them, and then also in the order that I like them best. So medical durable power of attorney, as I said, is probably your most flexible document. Most people, how many people have heard of powers of attorney before? Right? So in general, you can have powers of attorney to do anything. So you can give somebody a specific power of attorney to go register your car for you or to take out a loan for you. Banks have their own powers of attorney, and they like their forms, boy. So I tell people you can fill out whatever powers of attorney you want, but it's the institution that you give it to that's going to tell you whether they'll accept it or not. So you can't force a bank to accept a power of attorney. Those are called specific or special powers of attorney. There's something called a general power of attorney, and I like to simplify it and just say that basically tells somebody you can do anything I could do with my signature. Okay, so it's very broad. It's usually used for financial issues. But that's not what I'm going to be talking about. I'm going to be focused on a medical durable power of attorney. And when I say durable, what that means is it's still legally binding even if you're not conscious or not capable of confirming it. Going back to England and the common law, powers of attorney used to lose effect as soon as you couldn't verify that you'd given somebody the power of attorney. So that's what the durable stands for. And basically it gives your agent, somebody that you appoint, the power to make any medical treatment decision or have access to any medical records or relevant information in the case that you can't make those decisions for yourself. And we'll talk about what some of those situations might be as we go forward and get into living wills. One of the things that's nice is that no witnesses are required in the state of Colorado. I give you a sample form there that has some spaces for witnesses, but that's primarily for interstate use, and we'll talk about why I put those in there in a second. So how many people have heard of a living, oh, wait, I have a question, and please shout out questions anytime.
Before you get on to the next topic,
Yes.
so I'm in a situation, my mom is 97, she has dementia, but she's still living home alone, and this is her home. My brother has a written power of attorney, but we were told it doesn't become effective until two doctors sign off that she can care for herself, and then we have to go to court. Is that true? Or do you have, it's a notarized copy that she wrote herself, and power of attorney, and yet they won't let us use it?
Okay, so, yeah, good question. The question was, I just said we don't have to have witnesses for powers of attorney. What it sounds like you're describing with two doctors saying that she's not capable of making decisions for herself, and this is a 97-year-old independent mom who wants to keep living by herself, really falls under the living will, and people get them confused all the time, and they're two different documents, but a medical durable power of attorney just says who's going to make those decisions if I can't make them for myself. And it's usually it's an attending physician. It doesn't have to be two. For a living will, it does have to be two, and that's what I'm going to get into. So it's very timely comment. So the issue with the durable power of attorney is it's flexible in that it covers any situation. And when we get to the Catholic teachings on ordinary versus extraordinary care, it'll probably hopefully become more clear to you why a medical power of attorney is more useful to you or to your family members than a living will is. So a living will, a lot of people have heard of, right? How many people have heard living wills? And they're different. These are the ones that run the gamut. From state to state, some of them are equivalent to a medical power of attorney, and some of them are much more specific. So in Colorado, the statute governing living wills is really, really specific. So the first thing is, hang on just a second. You have to have a terminal condition, right? So this is typically what people think about when you're getting a recommendation for hospice. And so typically that means you have a medical doctor has said that this patient has likely 6 months or less life expectancy. And so that's what a terminal condition. So if you think about it, there's a lot of people out there, a lot of us have friends, family who have maybe some Alzheimer's, some early onset dementia, something like that. They probably aren't able to make medical treatment decisions for themselves, but they may not have a terminal condition. They may not be within 6 months of death. So already, your medical durable power of attorney is going to be more flexible than the living will, and it only gets worse. So the living will does require 2 witnesses. Physicians and nurses can't be those witnesses. People who have a financial interest in somebody's estate shouldn't and can't be witnesses by law. So a lot of times when I was a chaplain over at Penrose Hospital, we were charged with advising people of these things and these legal instruments, and they'd want to do a living will. We'd have to go from room to room and try and find, other people visiting other patients and ask them to be the witnesses for, the patient 2 doors down, and it was a little awkward. Then this is, I think, what you were getting at with your question. A living will requires that you have 2 physicians independently verify, one, that the patient's condition is terminal, we've talked about that, but also that a patient has been unconscious, comatose, or unable to make decisions for 7 consecutive days. So again, if you think about those situations where folks have memory issues, they have good days and they have bad days. They may have 2-3 days, 2-3 weeks where they can make their own medical decisions, and going all the way back to the first slide on patient autonomy, they should be making those decisions. Until a doctor, attending physician usually says, yeah, I need somebody else to make this decision on whether to move on with some treatment, or whether to be more aggressive in our treatment, or whether to withdraw some treatment. And we'll talk about that. So a living will does allow the withdrawal of artificial nourishment. We'll talk later on about whether that's a good idea or not. And then we'll also talk about using pain medicines to alleviate pain. Any questions before I move on? Yes? It is. So Five Wishes, and I can't remember who publishes it, but and it's not for profit. It's probably not for profit, but it's sort of a form that lays out not just who you want to make your decisions for you, which a power of attorney is, but also some sort of living will questions about whether you want treatment withdrawn. It also has indications for funeral, so it really is sort of a hybrid, if you will, of these. And I'm not against it. I'm not here to tell you for or against any of those forms. I would just say, consider what use you want for it. You know, it's convenient to have everything in one place, but you may not need all of it. And what I'll talk about as we get to the end of all these advanced medical documents is the more you have, the more likelihood there's going to be confusion. And so one of the first questions I ever got when I was giving this presentation to a bunch of nurses at Pikes Peak Hospice was, well, if someone has a living will and a durable power of attorney, which one, you know, supersedes, or which one is in force? And my answer was, it depends. Lawyers always say, it depends. And she said, no, it says in the statute that the living will always trumps. And I said, well, in general, because it's more specific and because all of these different conditions that I talked about have to be met, yes, the Colorado statute does say a living will take precedence over other documents. But I said, query me this. What if the living will was signed 15 years ago and the grandmother or the family member decided, you know, in the meantime, they'd converted to Catholicism or they'd converted to a different religion, and then they decide they've been living now with a family member who's been taking care of them for the last 3 years of their life as their health has declined, and they signed, you know, 2 days before a medical durable power of attorney saying, this is the person I want to make my decisions for me. I said, I can tell you that any probate judge, you know, every day of the week and twice on Sundays is going to allow that medical durable power of attorney more recently signed to govern who's making that decision if there's a conflict, right? And so the whole goal of this presentation is to give you some legal tools, if you will, to try and avoid conflict and to try and give some clarity to your family members. Circling back to the durable power of attorney, you can appoint as many agents as you'd like, but my strong recommendation is have one person who's appointed to be your agent that you trust, who knows your will and who knows what your belief systems are, and then maybe you have an alternate or even a third alternate if one of those people can't act. But if you appoint 3 kids to be your agents for medical treatment decisions, I can almost guarantee you that they will not universally decide on what's the right course of action. So consider this too, your agent may not necessarily be your spouse. My wife and I had this discussion when we were preparing our advanced medical directives, and she said, you know, I don't know if I want to be, I mean, if something were to happen to you and you were in a coma, God forbid, I don't know that I'd be, you know, in the right frame of mind to make these decisions. Why don't you make your aunt, who's a pediatric cardiologist, make her your agent? And we talked it through and talked about it and eventually decided, no, we'll be each other's agent and have our eldest son, if something were to happen to us, like if we were both to be in a car accident. He's 27 now, and he knows pretty much what our belief systems are. So that's kind of where I am. All right, we'll kind of go quickly through these because you get increasingly more focused, if you will, until we get to the medical orders for scope of treatment. How many of you have heard of a do not resuscitate order? So that's usually the order that says, and it's usually for people who have had multiple heart incidents, where they say in a hospital setting, a doctor says, I've talked to this patient, and this patient does not want to be resuscitated if they have a cardiac event, if they have a heart attack or a stroke. A lot of times, these are people who've had a heart attack before and have had CPR used on them. It's not pretty. It usually involves broken ribs. It's usually fairly painful. And so people who've gone through it a lot of times are like, hey, just let me go. And that's a do not resuscitate order in a hospital or a healthcare setting. There was a period many, many years ago where we tried to change that acronym of DNR to something different, something a little more accurate, called AND, or Allow Natural Death, because we really felt like in the chaplain community, that's what it was. Do not resuscitate sounds like somehow you're not doing something you're supposed to do, as opposed to allowing a natural death. But that's what it is. The CPR directive is just that in an outpatient setting. So somebody's had a heart attack, they've talked to their doctor, they tell the doctor, I do not want to be resuscitated. The doctor, and it has to be signed by a doctor, can sign a CPR directive. Sometimes you'll see people with a little bracelet or a necklace or something, and basically the whole point is to tell a paramedic or to tell a responding healthcare person, no, I've talked to my doctor, I don't want to be resuscitated. Now, I tell people, if you want the medical profession to do everything humanly possible to keep you alive, don't do any of this, okay? That's the status of care, that's the standard of care. So all these things are, if you have other specific wishes, one, what are they? And then two, the legal part, who's making those decisions? And then, like I said, at the end, we'll talk about what does the Catholic Church say about some of those decisions. All right, a proxy decision maker is just a cool thing in Colorado. It's not really an advanced medical directive, but it's a statute that gives direction to doctors and healthcare professionals as, okay, well, what do we do if there is no advanced directive? What if there's no power of attorney? What if there's no living will? What if we have no idea what this person wants? What do we do? And it's just a series of steps that the attending physician is supposed to take. Usually it's probably delegated to a nurse. Usually it's probably delegated to a social worker. But someone in that hospital chain of command is supposed to try and identify who are the interested parties. And interested parties obviously includes spouses and family members and adult children and things like that, but it can also include neighbors or other people. A lot of times in the emergency room, at least at Penrose when I was a chaplain there, we would have people come in who were homeless and didn't have any family. It was very difficult. And sometimes the only interested party was the person who was in the homeless camp next to them who brought them in or called 911. And so again, going back to autonomy, if that person's conscious, they should be making the decisions for themselves. But if not, there's no power of attorney, there's no living will. This is the system where you gather together all the interested parties and try and get them to agree amongst themselves who's going to be the one person who makes those decisions. You know, some people who are jaded like me now would say, well, it's just for the doctor and the hospital to protect their legal liability. But it is a very convenient tool, and many states don't have it, and I've had to have recourse to it a lot. So I'm really a big fan of proxy decision-maker process. Interested parties, we talked about that. Consensus. So reaching a consensus is required under the proxy decision maker, but again, it goes back to why I think it's good to have one person named as your medical power of attorney agent, as opposed to 2, 3, 4, whatever you do, don't do an odd number, or don't do an even number. So, but it just increases confusion and the chance that, again, when I was working for hospice, it's always like the long-lost son who's estranged who flies in from California who says, Mom wouldn't have want that, and it throws everything into crisis. If you have given a medical durable power of attorney to one person and they've got it, that usually, I mean, anybody can go to court and try and challenge that, whether it's a proxy decision maker, a living will, or a power of attorney. And the probate courts generally are good. They have about a 24-hour turnaround on weekdays, especially because these things always happen at the end of life, or they get more critical at the end of life. I'm here to help you try and avoid that. All right, the most recent one in Colorado is a medical order for scope of treatment. What they tried to do, with good hearts, they were recognizing that some hospitals, some healthcare facilities, especially some nursing facilities, just weren't honoring the powers of attorney. They weren't even asking if people had a living will or what their decisions were or who they wanted to make their decisions for them. So the idea was, well, we're going to come up with one piece of paper front and back. It'll be brightly colored and everybody will know what it is, and so it'll stick out of the medical record. And so I think it was made with the best of intentions. It was modeled on a form that was created in Oregon. And there's a part of me, I apologize in advance to anybody from the West Coast, but if anything comes out of Oregon, it's probably not Catholic. So, like I said, good intentions, and it was a good idea, but the one thing as we get into talking about Catholic teaching on end-of-life issues is none of these things are cookie cutter, right? And so you can say, I want no care at the end of my life, or I want a little care at the end of my life, or I want everything done possible at the end of my life, but that's just not how these decisions work, okay? I mean, these decisions are tailor-made for chaplains, but they're also tailor-made for attorneys, which is, you change the facts and I'll change my advice. And so, again, circling back to why I think the advanced medical directive that is most useful to you is a medical durable power of attorney. I'll leave these resources up here as we move into sort of the Catholic teaching on, the legal part is who makes the decisions, and that's what we're trying to clarify and give you some tools for. But then the question of what decisions does a Catholic Church support, I'm happy to talk about. But before I go into that, does anybody have any questions on the legal side of it? Yes, sir. I have heard of that happening. I visited a priest who was close to 100 years old in one of the nursing facilities, and he said, Deacon, they're telling me they're going to kick me out of here if I don't sign this most form. I was like, no, Father, they're not going to kick you out of here. Tell me who told you that, and I'll go talk to them. But that's another thing, is it's a very powerful form, and so I've heard that would be an abuse. I mean, you're supposed to sign that in front of witnesses, the most form. But does that mean that people aren't forging them? Well, they could probably do it with a power of attorney too, but no, that would not be legal for somebody to try and enforce a most form that has not been signed by a capable patient. Mm-hmm. Well, no, how do you get rid of it is a good question. So any of these documents you can get rid of by telling somebody you don't want to honor that anymore, by tearing it up, by burning it, doing anything that shows that you don't want that. That would go for a regular will as well. So again, just at the risk of oversimplifying, you know, a will is something that talks about where you want your possessions to go. And Jamie will talk about some language and stuff that you can put into your will. A living will is different. It's more like a power of attorney for health care. And you can get rid of any of them, even just by saying, if you're conscious, I no longer want that to be honored. The tricky part with the most form is that they stick it in all of your medical records. So you really do have to know who your primary care physician is and ask that person, hey, I've changed my mind, I've decided I want to do a power of attorney, I've decided I want to do a living will, I don't want this most form in effect, I'm tearing out my copy, I need you to go into my records and destroy any other copies that are living in there. Okay? I mean, the practical aspect of this too is a lot of these questions come up in the context of an emergency room setting, so you need to think about that. One of the things, and I do not subscribe to it, but our cell phones now are so powerful and ubiquitous. I've known people who have, I've known attorneys who advise people, have your paper copy and have it in a safe place, but also take a photocopy of it or take a picture of it so you have it on your cell phone, so you or your family members could call it up in the event there was an accident or something else that incapacitated you. These resources are good. The medical durable power of attorney template that I gave you that's in your folders is based on one that was originally published on the Colorado Catholic Conference website. So that's what that first site is. The next one is the National Catholic Bioethics Center. They have a lot of resources online that you can download. Spoiler alert, they do charge for some things, but nowadays most of them you can get in a PDF copy and then you can print it out yourself. And then the last one is an acronym for thewayoftheLordJesus.org. And that's a medical ethicist, Catholic medical ethicist, who has written more about medical ethics than I will ever know, and he's probably forgotten more about it, but he's very highly respected to this extent. Whenever I would have a tricky situation in one of these end-of-life issues, a lot of times I'd go to Bishop Sheridan and I would say, you know, what's your thought? And I gave him one that was particularly sticky. He said, you probably ought to talk to Father Larry Brennan. He's sort of the diocesan theologian. And I went to talk to Father Larry, and he went, you probably should talk to a bioethicist who specializes in this. And here's a guy that I know in St. Louis, call him. And I called him, and I ran this story by them all. He was like, have you checked this website? And I did. They've got like 100 different vignettes or different situations that cover a lot that I would have never thought about. So it's a really good website. So I commend those to your perusal. Sir? TheWayOfTheLordJesus.com. And so, yeah, he's written like 3, 4, 5 volume sets on this stuff, but it's all available and searchable online. So strongly recommend it. Yes, sir? So the question was, what happens if somebody wants to be released from the hospital and they won't allow it? This has been a big problem in COVID, during COVID more so. It used to be simply the doctor would say, no, I really advise against it, and then a nurse would say, I really advise against it, and then you get a chaplain to come in and say, we really advise against it. But if the family member or the patient themselves said, I'm leaving, you can't hold me here, absent some sort of a threat to themselves or others, some sort of a legal hold, you have the right to make decisions for yourself, including refusing treatment. And so usually what they'll do is they'll just note in the record, the patient was discharged against medical advice, or AMA. And so that's what should happen. I've heard horror stories, especially in COVID, that it didn't under various public health emergencies, but I've never been pointed to any legal document, either in the state or in the federal, that would allow you to keep somebody against their will unless they, have suicidal tendencies or homicidal tendencies. Any other questions? And then I'd just like to talk real briefly, how much time do I have? About ordinary versus extraordinary care, and then a couple situations on pain management, hospice, and artificial nutrition and hydration. So, in general, the Catholic Church, the U.S. Conference for Catholic Bishops has set out another document. I should have had it on here and I don't, but it's called the ERDs, the Ethical and Religious Treatment Directives for Catholic Healthcare Entities, and it's a fabulous document, okay? I think it's in its 6th edition right now, and you can get it if you go to the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops website, USCCB, if you just search on Google or Bing or DuckDuckGo or whatever search engine you use, USCCB ERDs, Ethical and Religious Directives. You can download it. It's about 60 pages. And again, it's addressed to hospitals and doctors and nurses and healthcare entities, but it really does a wonderful job of explaining not just what Catholic entities can or should do or shouldn't do, but why. And so, the first edition, it basically said, thou shalt not. Thou shalt not kill people. Thou shalt not have assisted suicide. Thou shalt not do abortions. But this 6th edition, in all those iterations, really does a nice job of tracing Catholic teaching through the centuries even, and why the Church teaches these things. Sir? The USCCB, so www.usccb.org. And again, what you're searching for then is the Ethical and Religious Directives, commonly referred to as the ERDs. So the Catholic Church at the 10,000-foot level draws a distinction between what they call ordinary and extraordinary care, okay? And ordinary care are those things that are ordinary. That's the standard of care. That's things that Catholics and all people of goodwill are obliged morally to do to try and preserve life, right? Life is sacred from the moment of conception till natural death, and we have a duty as Catholics to preserve that life, but it's not a duty that always applies in every situation. So an example of ordinary care might be if you have a fever or you have an infection being treated with antibiotics. So that would be an example of ordinary care. The tricky part is, as we all know, medical care evolves and gets better and better. So what might have been extraordinary, what would have been a experimental treatment 10 years ago, is now the standard of care. That's now ordinary. So it doesn't do us a lot of good to say, well, in my living will or my medical power of attorney, I only want what's ordinary care, because what's ordinary or extraordinary today may be different tomorrow. You may find that some treatments that are standard of care today, either because they were not properly tested or new information has come out that says there's a long-term health risk, they become experimental or extraordinary down the road. So that's a general thing. If something's extraordinary care, if something's experimental care almost, then you're not morally, you can ask for it, but you're not morally obliged to. And so I think as we get into issues like artificial nutrition and hydration, maybe it'll make some more sense. So the 5th edition of the ERDs, the main change really was on what to do with artificial feeding and hydration. And it was born after that Terri Schiavo case, if some of you remember that, where she was in what's called a persistent vegetative state. So her medical condition was unique in that the doctors were saying, oh, there are no brain waves, and some family members were disputing that. But the bottom line was she was likely to live indefinitely as long as she was given food and water. And the U.S. bishops, at the end of that nasty, nasty legal battle, wrote to Rome and wrote to the Congregation for Doctrine of the Faith and said, what's the teaching? What's the church's teaching on this? So even bishops, were sort of divided or had questions about it. And the word came down from Rome that, just what I said, if a patient is generally expected to live indefinitely, as long as you give them food and water, even if that's artificially, then that's ordinary care. You're expected to provide food and water for that patient. And so that was the clarification that came out in the 5th edition of the ERDs. The 6th edition of the ERDs, the differences are all about how do Catholic healthcare institutions cooperate, partner, merge, acquire, run non-Catholic hospitals, because if anybody's been following the healthcare industry, you know, when I started in this 15 or 20 years ago, Catholic Health Initiatives who's now Common Spirit, but you know, they used to pick up and buy a hospital here or there, and then in the last 10 or 15 years, then they bought whole systems, and now, you know, you have the two biggest Catholic healthcare systems in the nation combining to form Common Spirit. So, but the question was, some of those hospitals are not Catholic, and politicians have a big concern that if Catholics take over all of the healthcare at a particular entity, then reproductive health or abortions won't be available to the poor. So that was what the 6th edition of the ERDs was designed to help Catholic healthcare entities figure out, what do you do when you're buying up and acquiring. And it could be Lutheran, it could be another medical, it could be another faith group, or it could be a purely secular group like the University of Colorado Health. All right, so any questions on artificial nutrition and hydration? Because, oh, go ahead.
Well, unless you get to this later,
Uh,
about that understanding within the hospice environment.
Yes, so that's exactly where I was going later. So what happens, and I've lost both my parents, and both of them had excellent hospice care, and so I learned a lot, even, you know, more than I thought I knew about the dying process. And one of the things that happens when somebody is dying, you know, not of a traumatic brain injury, or not of a traumatic injury, is your body starts to shut down, the systems start to shut down, and that includes the body's ability to absorb food and water. And so at some point, especially if they're not conscious, or if you're doing artificial food nutrition and hydration, the body starts to reject that stuff, and it can actually become painful and or harmful and or hasten death. So I tell people in hospice, they talk about, well, patients have months to years to live, or weeks to months to live, or days to weeks to live. When you get down to having hours or days to live, and the body is actively shutting down, at that point, it becomes permissible to withhold artificial nutrition or hydration, or any nutrition hydration. I mean, my mom was conscious, but, you know, we were feeding her ice chips and just trying to, you know, keep her mouth moist, but she was not consuming enough water, you know, to stay alive for more than 3 or 5 or 7 days. And it was hard for me as a son, but I think it's important for you to know that that's morally permissible. And it's tied in a lot with pain medicines. You know, some people talk about, well, they're going to give mom an overdose of morphine and that's going to kill her. Well, that would be against Catholic teaching, right? Any act or omission that's intended to kill someone is not morally permissible. But the ethical and religious directives that I talked about specifically say it is permissible. The treatment of pain is a good. And so that treatment of pain is permissible and morally allowable, even if an unintended consequence might be that it would hasten death. So with morphine and some of those drugs, you probably know, it tends to slow down your respiration, it lowers your blood pressure, and so some people are concerned about, you know, providing pain medicine that might, you know, inadvertently hasten someone's death. That's morally permissible, okay? And it's spelled out, I think, in beautiful language in those ethical and religious directives, better than I could say it. But that's important. I went and gave this presentation to a group of nuns who had a particularly painful situation where one of their sisters died in a very painful way. But she was adamant she did not want any pain medicine. She wanted to unite her suffering with Christ's, and she was fine with that, but a lot of her fellow sisters were not fine with that. And so they were kind of relieved to hear that, okay, but if I want pain medicine, I can have it? Yes, the Catholic Church says you can do that. How many of you heard of what's called palliative care, or the palliative medicine? So palliative medicine is basically the alleviation of symptoms, and palliative medicine has evolved. If you think about how far oncology or cancer care has come in the last 25 years, palliative medicine has as well. So I was good friends with the chief medical officer for Pikes Peak Hospice and palliative care years ago, and he would come and do some of these presentations with me, especially to doctors. And he said, you know, 20 years ago, I basically had 3 options. I could let you suffer, I could give you a little pain to take the edge off, or I could make you unconscious. Those were the 3 options he had as a treating physician in palliative care. He said that practice of medicine has evolved so far in the last 15 or 20 years that really you can turn on and off the alleviation of pain. So one of the things was when you give people heavy doses of narcotics, a lot of times there's other health issues that causes, constipation, some other things. Nowadays they have the ability in pharmacies to do compounding, and so they'll put all of those things, not just to relieve the pain, but to alleviate all those side effects in one pill or one treatment, one patch. There's a lot of other treatment mechanisms too that are available. So if you're ever in a situation where you see somebody, a family member, a friend, anybody who looks like they're in intractable pain, in a healthcare situation or not, ask for a referral to a palliative care specialist, because it really is a specialized area of medicine, and just because somebody can treat cancer doesn't mean they know how to treat all the symptoms of cancer in the best way or the most recent way. So I'm a big proponent of hospice, I'm a big proponent of palliative care, and I'm a big proponent of telling people there's no reason with today's state of medicine that anyone needs to die in pain. Okay? Yes, ma'am.
And on that note, I just want to say that the longer that people will die, you know, it should be their desire or their wish
Mhm.
not to have food and water. They can't take it in, they can't
Right.
digest it, and family members tend to get really anxious. Oh, you've got to eat, you've got to drink. But I would say to people, do you want to?
Yes.
And they would say no, and trying to tell the families, you don't have to force this. So that's a big issue that we all face.
I agree. Did everybody hear Rosemary? So, yeah, the idea is, and it goes back to my first slide on patient autonomy. If the patient can tell you what they want, they have a legal right to do it, and they have a moral right to accept or refuse treatment up to and including food and water. So,
And on the second note, that as far as pain goes, if you can alleviate pain, if the patient wishes to be treated, and you can alleviate pain, it brings their anxiety down so far. You know, we should all die with dignity, and relieving pain helps a person do this. So, I just wanted to add that.
so I'll have two last comments, and then I'll open it up for questions. So one, you know, that's the whole focus of a hospice, is moving towards trying to cure a disease to trying to treat the symptoms and make somebody comfortable. We've had patients who have been in hospice for 12, 18, 24 months, and they're like, oh, thank God, all I needed was to be able to get a good night's sleep. And so we somewhat joke in a good manner about, I'm sorry, you're too healthy now. You graduated from hospice, okay? Come back when you get worse. But they're like, no, I like this treatment. I like my team. I like my chaplain. So that's a good problem to have. The second is going back to that scope of treatment all the way up to, sometimes they call it now terminal sedation. But what my friend, who was the medical director, said was, I can give somebody enough of a dose of whatever the proper medicine is, and I talk to the patient if they can, or I talk to their parent, their family members about what I'm doing, but I'm just going to give them enough that allow them to sleep comfortably for 12 hours and then bring them back out of it. And he said 9 times out of 10 when I've done that, they've woken back up and they've been out of pain, and they've been like, all I needed was 12 hours of uninterrupted sleep. Because, you know, even in a hospital setting, you got nurses coming in, you got people changing the bed, it's difficult sometimes to sleep in a hospital setting. So, you know, I trust the doctors at Penrose, St. Francis, and the Catholic healthcare systems. I've had a few situations where nurses were concerned that something was done inappropriately, that an inappropriate dosage of medication was given. And again, that was 3 medical directors ago. But, you know, the CEO, there's a system in place for those complaints to happen, and even patients can make them or family members can make them. And the one time in about 10 that I was personally aware of, that it was determined that, yeah, that probably was somebody intending to hasten someone's death. That doctor's medical license was revoked and they were fired. And so, like I said, I have a lot of faith in our Catholic healthcare institutions. Can't tell you about the other ones, but any questions before I turn it over? Yes?
What about home hospice care versus hospice care in a facility?
Yeah, I would say 90% of hospice that I'm aware of is their goal is to do it in a home setting. The treatments at home are much more robust than they used to be. So typically somebody in Pikes Peak Hospice, they typically have between 150 and 200 patients. Their inpatient wing has 6 beds. Okay, so usually those patients are really in advanced stages of dying. They're in the hours to days. phase of their situation. But if you can care for somebody, again, most people would prefer to die in the comfort of their home with family around them than they would in any type of, no matter how nice it is, healthcare setting. So that's just what I've seen. The inpatient one is people who require multiple monitored systems of, whether it's for breathing or heartbeat or anything like that. So I would say that's the exception, not the rule, to be inpatient.
So home hospice care, you still have nurses come occasionally during the day, or how does that work?
Yeah, and it depends. So the question was, in home hospice setting, do the nurses come? The answer is depending on what the situation is. So sometimes they come once or twice a week. Sometimes they'll come once or twice a day. There's a cost associated with that typically. But the bigger thing is usually it's an interdisciplinary team. So it's not just a CNA or a nurse or a doctor. It's all of those people working as a team with a chaplain, with a social worker, to help not just the patient who's dying, but the family working through that grief process and just informing them on what to expect. And for me, when my mom died 22 years ago, that was the most comforting thing. And it's the flip side of the beginning of life with birth. When my eldest was born in Okinawa, Japan, my mom came out, and I can't put a price tag on the fact of every time my wife and I would freak out, she's like, "No, it's okay. That's what babies do." Well, in the hospice setting, it's a chaplain or somebody saying, "No, that's okay. That's what dying people do." So, yes, ma'am.
I would like to also mention that, speaking of the hospice situation in the home, when you have therapy order, it's not to help make them stronger, better, something like that. It's to help them be more comfortable.
Correct.
Occupational therapists will go in to help decide what kind of equipment will be helpful. Or if they needing a wheelchair or bathroom equipment or bedroom area, bedside table, things like this. Or at the time, if they're still able to do as much as they can, maybe different kinds of feeding or dressing or grooming or toileting, adaptive equipment. Physical therapists will do exercises, not to, like I said, strengthen, but to maintain the strength that they have. And as maybe their strength decreases, they're going to be continuing to exercise to show the family how to, so they're comfortable, they're making movements happen, even if they're bedridden, because we want to be more comfortable, whether in a chair or in bed, as much as we can too.
Absolutely. And the other thing that the nurses will come in when you start home hospice care, they'll come in and help assess the living space for this person, whether it's a bedroom or whether it's getting from the bedroom to the bathroom, how to avoid slips, trips, and falls. Because a lot of times that's what happens, that exacerbates a situation or hastens death, is they're trying to get from one room to another. They're trying to use, whatever mobility they have, how to make that as safe as possible. So that they're as comfortable as possible. Yes, sir?
I think maybe you call it sedation, but just to make sure I understand it. Could be the scenario where sedation actually kills, or maybe even intentionally kills.
That would be against Catholic teaching.
Okay, and say you have a hospice that says that we do not do intravenous feeding or hydration, and pain medication is given such that that patient is not in a position to eat because they're knocked out.
So the question was, what if there's a hospice that tells you that we don't do intravenous or any type of artificial nutrition or hydration? One, there's a lot of hospices in town, and at least Pikes Peak Hospice and Palliative Care, which is a nonprofit, spoiler alert, I am the vice chair of their board of directors, but they will do that. So you got options, and you have probably more options in hospice care now than you ever did. Many of them are for-profit. Like I said, Pikes Peak is the only one I know that's a not-for-profit here in town. There's a coalition of not-for-profits up and down the Front Range, but so one thing is, if the hospice is not giving you the care that you think you or your family member is entitled to, you can ask to be transferred to a different hospice. And the second is, again, I use the term terminal sedation because that's what you'll sometimes hear in a healthcare setting. The terminal part is where the Catholic Church would have a problem with it. If your intention is to hasten someone's death, then that's not permissible. If your intention is to relieve pain, and I think I told you the story where you do it for a little bit of time to see if that helps, and then bring them back out. But again, and the last time I had this discussion and gave this presentation with the doctor was 7 years ago. Even back then, he said there's very, very rare cases where that's required, where I cannot stop someone's pain short of making them unconscious. And then, like I said, that's when the sedation would happen in order for a certain period of time, whether that's 6 hours, 12 hours, 24 hours, and then bring the person back to consciousness. Because the last thing is, Catholics also have a right to be conscious if they can be as they approach death, whether they want to be praying, whether they want to be talking with family members, whether they want to receive the sacraments. So it's a balancing act, especially when you get to people who have really, really intractable or severe pain. But again, at least the status of palliative care 7 years ago was it was very, very rare that the pain couldn't be treated with some combination of medicines or treatments. So it's not, I would say it's faith-based, and it honors faith. They have chaplains of all denominations in there. We had one in Denver that didn't last long. Healthcare is such a regulated industry, and you and I can talk afterwards about why that is. But no, I'm not aware of any Catholic, openly Catholic health, hospice organization in the state of Colorado. I will, one good thing, though, I will tell you, back when the laws was passed about assisted suicide and doctors can prescribe pain medicines, Pikes Peak Hospice and all the nonprofit hospices in Colorado got together and said, we're not playing that game. One of the doctors on the board that I know said, we don't practice veterinary medicine here, and we don't put patients down. So even though they're not Catholic, like I said, they have a faith aspect or viewpoint. Yes, ma'am.
Could you ask in relation to that, if you specifically felt like you needed a Catholic hospice worker
Mm-hmm.
overseer, could you go to Pikes Peak and say, is there a Catholic?
Absolutely. And so you can ask for anything. The question was, if you felt more comfortable having a Catholic nurse or a Catholic chaplain, or you certainly can ask for that. I can't guarantee that they will have enough on staff. I mean, healthcare workers are dropping like flies and dropping out of the workforce like flies, so there's a supply and demand issue. But in the draft durable power of attorney I gave you in your packages, it has in there a thing that says, if anybody has questions about whether a specific treatment is in accordance with the Catholic Church, please contact my pastor, or please contact, a Catholic ethicist. And so even University Hospital has Catholic chaplains, and Monsignor Jaeger is really, really good about telling them they need more. So, any other questions? Yes, ma'am? I will be honest and say I don't know, but then I'll be an attorney and say it probably depends. So all the Catholic organizations have what they call charity care, and so their goal or their ethos is nobody's going to be denied care because they can't afford it. And Pikes Peak Hospice at least has that same thought process. A lot of these things are covered by Medicare and Medicaid, hospice treatments included. So a lot of times that's the paying source, not the family. But I can't tell you for sure that everything's free. That's just not the reality in our healthcare system. All right, well, thank you. You've been a wonderful audience. Excellent questions. I will stick around if people have specific questions.
My name's Jamie Crane. I'm the Director of Development and Plan Giving for the diocese with the bishop. So my main thing I want to talk to you is about legacy or legacy giving. So Catholic legacy, right? It's shown through your actions. It's how you share with your families. It's how you do everything day to day. And what you leave can provide for your families, it provides for your loved ones, but it can also provide for your church and your ministries that mean so much to you right now. It's all part of your Catholic legacy. So how you live and how you die. And like the topic is, not many people like to talk about dying, but the truth is right now is the only time that you can have say on where your stuff is going to go. And so it's really important to plan and get ahead of it. So plan giving is a way to take care of your family and charity or your different places that you mean a lot to you, so including your parish or your church. So it's not about disinheriting your family, because that's common. Even when I was talking to my mom about this, she's like, let me get this straight, Jamie. You wouldn't want me to disinherit you and give to the church. And I said, no, 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 it's not about disinheriting your family members. It's about disinheriting the government or taxes from those items that you have. And that's the key to plan giving and writing it down. So I'm going to break it down for you right here. So the average American's distribution of wealth is represented in these two jars. The small jar has 90 pennies. The large jar has 910 pennies. So the small jar is where Americans keep, or most Americans keep your day-to-day spending. It's where you go to pay for your groceries, your bills, your current charity. For me, it's private school, or my kids are in Catholic school. It's the soccer, lacrosse, football, all of that, all from that small jar. Any guesses to what is the large jar? Yep, stuff. 91% of people's wealth is held in stuff, such as home equity, your life insurance, your retirement, all those areas. That's what plan giving's about. It's how to give from the large jar, and it's typically at a later time, which is great because it's not going to take away from your current lifestyle. So here in the diocese, we have our Catholic Legacy Society. Basically, it's just a way for us to honor those who have made the decision to keep or to include their parish, the diocese, maybe it's Catholic Charities of Central Colorado, something that's in our area. They've made that a part of their legacy and have included one of those in their life plans. We get together every year with a mass and a luncheon with Bishop. There's usually a guest speaker. This year is supposed to be Bishop Golka, since this is his first one with us. And so we have just a great time honoring each other and taking the time. So now the first important thing, and I know it's really little, but there's so much information, is the biggest thing I can emphasize is a will, or what is also referred to a trust or something along those lines. Basically writing down what's important to you. Remembering some of what he had shared about, or what you touched on, I know this lady who was at our parish. She was a devout Catholic. She was there every week for rosary, for all these different beautiful things, and she did not have a will. She did not have anything planned, and her son had fallen away from the church. So when she passed away, she didn't have the beautiful Catholic Mass because her son was in charge of it and didn't know. For the rest of us who knew this lady, she would have loved to have had all of those beautiful ceremonies that are part of the Catholic Mass, and it's all because it wasn't written down. So kind of some misnomers. So to emphasize with the will, I was trying to look. So the first question, or the statements that we get a lot is, wills do a bit more than just, I don't have money, or I don't have property, I don't really need a will. They do so much more. So kind of what I was touching on, you can write down your funeral wishes. You can say where your kids are going, or your pets. You can make sure that all of your plans are down and followed. The next one I would emphasize is, my family knows what I'm doing. I've heard a couple statements too. My family knows. It's fine. They've got me. Well, they might know, but if it's not written down legally in a lot of instances, then it's not going to be their decision. It's going to be the court or the government deciding for them. And it's sometimes a very long, lengthy process. It can be costly, and so it's not very doable. And then writing your will can be long and complicated and expensive process. Well, not necessarily. It also depends on what estate you have. But what we have done here at the diocese is we partnered with a great company called Free Will, and that's exactly what they can help you with. It's an online service, and you have a pamphlet in your folders that we give you that it takes 20 minutes about, and it will walk you through all the necessary things that you need to do a basic will. And it's free, completely free for you. And so it's a great tool. And then at the very end, if you are have one of those more complicated estates, it'll flag it for you and kind of get you ready to go to attorney. So it'll save you time before needing to write something down and presenting it with the attorney. You also, in your pamphlet, have a planning guide that can do the same things as the online stuff. So it's kind of a written tool that you have, and then also the online one. But basically what I would highly encourage is, at the very least, if you don't have an up-to-date will or estate plan or trust, definitely now is the best time to be doing it. And because I want to say that the statistic is like 84% of Americans today do not have an estate plan, don't have anything written down. And I think for the last 2 years, we've realized how quickly life can end. And so really, like I said, the only time to decide any of this is going to be right now. So the other thing I would emphasize is, a lot of people don't think about leaving gifts to their church or to their parishes because they don't think they can make a big impact. You don't need to have a big estate, and you don't need to be doing big amounts of gifts to make such a big impact. So I wanted to share just a couple stories of some of our Legacy Society members with you. So the first one is Mr. James Verone. So he worked at Peakview Coal Mine and Peak Steel, and he attended Corpus Christi School back in the 1920s. And that school meant a lot to him throughout his whole entire life. So what Mr. Verone did is he remembered Corpus Christi School in his will. And per his instructions in his will, he set up an endowment with our Catholic Foundation. And today that endowment provides tuition on average for 2 students to attend school each year, which is a great lasting impact. So endowments are great ways to give a lasting gift. They give perpetually. And so right here in our Catholic Foundation, you can set up your own endowment, just like Mr. Verone did. Or we do have endowments set up for every single one of our parishes, every single one of our Catholic schools, as well as our main ministries. Or you can come up with your own if there's a ministry that we don't have covered. So it's a great way of giving perpetually and leaving a lasting impact. So if you think about it, he was a coal mine and a steel worker. And he left a gift that is today still impacting countless numbers of children. And you can even give a today gift to these endowments so you can kind of feed it before you end your life. So the next lady is Miss Paula Gillette. Now, Miss Paula loved her family, she loved her parish, and she loved Catholic education. So when she passed away in 2015, what she did is she listed St. Dominic Catholic Church and Divine Redeemer Catholic School on her beneficiary form of her retirement accounts. So it lasted a great impact, and it kind of made a statement to her family as well of what was important to her, not just her family, but also her church and her school. Now, retirement accounts are great ways to give gifts. So now they can pass between spouses just fine, and depending on which one you have or what kind of retirement account you have. But if you try and pass it down to an heir, it can have a pretty hefty tax on it, depending on what it is. And it can be 50% or higher. So that's basically cutting what you thought would be a lovely gift to your kids or to your grandkids in half. But what's great about so basically what it is it's called a bad asset to hand down to people. A good one would be real estate, life insurance. Those are kind of made to go past spouses. But when you gift it to a charity such as your parish or a Catholic school, the full value of it completely goes to supporting it. And so it's a better asset to leave towards a charity rather than heirs. And I would highly encourage looking into your retirement accounts to see which one you might have, because there's so many out there. The other part would be it does not require a lawyer. So all you have to do is list on your beneficiary form where you would like this to go. So for me, I have 3 kids, so I listed the church as my 4th kid so that it's divided evenly. So that's an example that you can do, or you can have it as a secondary beneficiary. So it's kind of a layered effect, depending on what you're looking to do. But it makes a great impact, and that's what Paula Gillette did. So staying on the topic of retirement accounts, qualified charitable distributions are really worth mentioning. They're also referred to as IRA rollovers. So these are ways to give from your retirement accounts today, and so they're considered in the planned giving area. So specifically for a QCD, it's usually 70 and a half or older. Allow you to do a direct gift from your retirement account into a charity. So what this benefit is commonly when you make the distributions from there, it'll come into your ordinary income usually making it a tax liability, or it can bump you into a higher tax bracket. So perhaps you want to avoid that, but you also want to be supporting your charity or church. That's where these are great ways, because when you direct it to the charity or your parish, it goes completely for the full value. It does not go into your income, and so it really gives you a good tax break. The other part of this would be the required minimum distributions for 72 and above. So you are required to make distributions from your retirement accounts, typically an IRA account. And so these, same way, they can save you. So perhaps you don't really need that distribution, but you want to be supporting your church today. You can count your RMDs as a QCD gift, and thus not bumping you up into those tax brackets that might not be very friendly to do. So those are kind of the biggest and best ways to have an impactful gift. There's countless and countless amounts of different plan giving options, but these are the most friendly. They're the ones that can actually make a huge impact on your family and on the church that is part of your family. At least for me it is. So just in closing, we would love to welcome you into the Catholic Legacy Society. So I encourage you to include your parish or maybe one of your ministries that you care about right now, that you're providing for right now in some way, a part of your legacy. It can also make a great statement to your family on what is really important to you, faith and belief-wise. So, and like I've emphasized, funeral and writing down your wishes now is probably the biggest gift that you could do for your family. I have heard stories too of the casket story would be if mom didn't write down her wishes and you have one, brother that's kind of like, well, let's just move forward and not, going through the process. But there's another person who's, mom deserves the best, so we're gonna get the $50,000 casket. And maybe mom didn't want that. So writing your wishes down, making sure that your belief in your faith is written down and your family knows, and so it takes all of the grief and the questioning out. They can just follow the wishes. They know exactly what you're doing. Rosemary does a great job here of walking through with families, figuring out what liturgy you want, what songs you might want, and all those different areas. So that would be my biggest emphasis if you want to make any kind of impact or legacy, right? Write your wishes down. So I guess questions now, right? And thank you for hanging out over time.